We are, just a little bit of a background, we're both assistant professors of professional practice at LSU in the School of Social Work. But prior to that, we were both school-based social workers, working in about 7 parishes in Louisiana, doing school-based mental health. So a lot of kids that we treated had trauma. And so we were able to provide mental health counseling to those kids, as well as work with their teachers and their schools, with the staff and administration. So just to give you a little background on us, we will have, at the end of the presentation, we have a slide with our contact information. So if you are interested in PDs on trauma sensitive schools, or if there's any other information that you feel you would like to know more about, please reach out to us and let us know. We're more than happy to do that. We like to talk, and we love to talk about school-based issues and trying to help schools. So if you need anything, please reach out to us and let us know. So before we get started, I wanted to talk about this quote. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but it states, 9 times out of 10, the story behind the misbehavior won't make you angry, it will break your heart. And so I go back to this quote a lot, especially when I'm working with kids who have a lot of behavior issues and difficulties in schools, because we don't know what the reasoning behind the behavior is. But the more research is coming out, the more it states that a lot of trauma is the root behind some behaviors. So there's usually about 3 reasons for behavior. That could be for social attention. That could be good or bad. So we see in some kids that even bad attention is better than no attention at all. Even for tangible things like getting something that they want, or getting to do something that they want to do, or either escape and avoidance. So that's getting out of things that they don't want to do, or getting away from people they don't want to be around. So we look at a lot of that behavior and trauma and how they are related. We can say that prior to COVID and the recent events that have been going on, usually it was about 1 in 5 kids had experienced a traumatic event, but we know that that number is, significantly going to change, especially with COVID and the civil unrest that we're seeing. So we have a lot of students who've experienced those things in such a short amount of time. So as teachers, as administration, school officials, we just need to be very vigilant and start working on meeting the kids, not only for their academic needs, but for their emotional and mental health needs when school resumes in the fall, whatever that may look like. So that's just a little quote that I like to share with everyone. But our objectives for today, we are going to identify some trauma-informed principles. We're going to learn some techniques on how to respond to trauma-exposed students, and we're going to increase understanding of what a trauma-informed school, classroom, and teacher looks like. So you're going to hear the word trauma-sensitive and trauma-informed a lot. We're going to use those words interchangeably, but this is just kind of a little bit about what we're going to do today. We only have an hour, and like I said, Dr. Bailey and I can talk all day about trauma-informed and school-based mental health. So if there's any questions that you may have, please feel free to ask. We did leave a little bit of time at the end of the presentation to answer some of your questions. So before we get started in knowing about trauma and how to be a trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed teacher school and have a trauma-informed classroom, I'm going to show you this very brief short video. It's about 4 minutes, and it talks about trauma, and it talks about the stress on a brain. And so I think this is very beneficial, especially because it gives us kind of that foundation for this presentation.
Science tells us that the experiences we have in the first years of our lives actually affect the physical architecture of the developing brain. This means that brains aren't just born, they're also built over time based on our experiences. Just as a house needs a sturdy foundation to support the walls and roof, a brain needs a good base to support all future development. Positive interactions between young children and their caregivers literally build the architecture of the developing brain. Building a sturdy foundation in the earliest years provides a good base for a lifetime of good mental function and better overall health. So just how is a solid brain foundation built and maintained in a developing child? One way is through what brain experts call serve and return interactions. Imagine a tennis match between a caregiver and a child, but instead of hitting a ball back and forth across a net, various forms of communication pass between the two. From eye contact to touch, from singing to simple games like peekaboo. These interactions, repeated throughout a young person's developing years, are the bricks that build a healthy foundation for all future development. But another kind of childhood experience shapes brain development too, and that's stress. Good kinds of stress, like meeting new people or studying for a test, are healthy for development because they prepare kids to cope with future challenges. Another kind of stress, called toxic stress, is bad for brain development. If a child is exposed to serious ongoing hardships like abuse and neglect, and he has no other caregiver in his life to provide support, the basic structures of his developing brain may be damaged. Without a sturdy foundation to properly support future development, he is at risk for a lifetime of health problems, development issues, even addiction. It's possible to fix some of the damage of toxic stress later on, but it's easier, more effective, and less expensive to build solid brain architecture in the first place. One of the things that sturdy brain architecture supports is the development of basic emotional and social skills, an important group of skills which scientists call executive function and self-regulation can be thought of like air traffic control in the child's mental airspace. Think of a young child's brain as the control tower at a busy airport. All those planes landing and taking off and all of the support systems on the ground simultaneously demand the controller's attention to avoid a crash. It's the same with a young child learning to pay attention, plan ahead and remember, and follow lots of rules. Like all of us, kids have to react to things happening in the world around them, while also dealing with worries, temptations, and obligations on their minds. As these demands for attention pile up, air traffic control helps a child regulate the flow of information, prioritize tasks, and above all, find ways to manage stress and avoid mental collisions along the way. Having this ability is a necessity for positive and level mental health. Developing effective air traffic control, overcoming toxic stress, and building solid brain architecture are things kids can't do on their own. And since strong societies are made up of healthy, contributing individuals, it's up to us as a community to make sure all young people have the kinds of nurturing experiences they need for positive development. To build better futures, we need to build better brains.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit now about some risk factors to consider. And these risk factors are usually indicators on prolonged traumatic stress symptoms for people who've experienced traumatic events. So a lot of the research and presentations and experience that Dr. Bailey and I have, we focus a lot on trauma-informed practices and trauma-informed care for kids, especially in the classroom. A lot of research is coming out now stating that traditional behavior modifications that we implement in the classrooms are not effective for kids who have experienced a traumatic event. And so what we hope that you get out of this presentation today is that you walk away knowing and understanding a little bit about trauma and how to implement those resources in your classroom. It's very important for us to know that when we look at when we're doing trainings on bloodborne pathogens, when we're treating how every child's blood, if a kid is bleeding, you treat that as if that blood was contaminated, whether it is or not. And that's what we're hoping to get from this presentation, is that you walk away looking at every child as if there is a possibility that they have experienced a traumatic event. These resources that we're going to provide today will definitely help you to understand how to implement some things in your classroom. So again, this is not like a cookie cutter. If this happened, then you will have the long-term effects of traumatic events or traumatic stress. This is just kind of some things that research has shown that or risk factors to consider. So we've had a lot of times where there was a child who has experienced a traumatic event, siblings, and one sibling could have a very good reaction to that intervention, and those resources, and the same sibling who experienced the same event does not. And so that's why we encourage you, if you haven't already had some training or professional development on adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs study, to do that. Research all of those about resilience, how a child is resilient, because trauma looks different in everybody. So we're going to start with the severity of the event. How serious was the event? How badly was the child or someone she loves, were they hurt physically? Did they or someone they love need to go to the hospital? Were the police involved? Were children separated from their caregivers? Were they interviewed by a principal or police officer or counselor? Did a friend or family member die? These are some risk factors to consider when you're looking at the severity of the event. So if we take, for example, Hurricane Katrina, all of these things could have impacted the severity of the event, because a lot of students had all of these criteria. And so when you're looking at also child abuse or neglect, if you're looking at the flood, if you're looking at civil unrest, all of these things play into that factor of the severity of the event, and if that child will have a prolonged sense of traumatic stress. The proximity of the event. So was the child actually at the place where the event occurred? Did they see the event happen to someone else, or were they a victim? Did the child watch the event on television? Did they hear a loved one talk about what happened? So a lot of times in our practice, we do encourage parents to limit the amount of media coverage that their children are watching, not only for them, but also for parents. Because if you've experienced a traumatic event, especially one that's been televised, and you're watching it over and over and over, and you're reliving that trauma each time. So all of those emotions and all of that comes into play. We also encourage parents to talk about what is going on. We don't want to hide things from kids, but a lot of that in that conversation, it depends on their developmental level, and the comfort level of the parent as well. But we don't want to ever not talk about what is going on. We don't ever want to hide things from kids, because that doesn't help them process what is going on. So Dr. Bailey and I have, one of our research studies was, we were looking at the impacts of Hurricane Katrina on kids that had relocated to Baton Rouge 3 to 5 years post Katrina. And so Dr. Bailey had used a lot of the research with the older kids, and I looked at the research for the younger kids. And what we found was the parents that were reporting the symptoms that their kids had were really the symptoms that the parents had. And so a lot of that is the parents are experiencing these, and it kind of trickles down to the kids. So that's why it's very important for parents to have conversations with kids about what they're feeling and what is going on. Again, we're going to talk more about the caregiver's reaction. So did the child's family believe what the child was saying? Did the caregivers take the child's reaction seriously? How did the caregivers respond to the child's needs, and how did they cope with the events themselves? So again, like I said, with that research that we had looked at, caregivers' reactions and what they were, how they were feeling and how they addressed the situation definitely had an impact on the kids. And we can say this again with the, if you look at the ACEs study, kids who've been exposed to multiple traumatic events are more likely to develop that traumatic stress reactions, and for those traumatic stress reactions to continue into adulthood. And this is a big one, family and community factors. And so we know that in some cultures and race ethnicities, those communities are very tight knit, and they are really good support systems. And so that is very good for a child who's experienced a traumatic event, to have that community support. But as we are seeing now, a lot of race and discrimination is going on, and that is intensifying the child's traumatic stress symptoms. So whereas this event is going on top of experiencing that racial discrimination, that is prolonging and increasing the traumatic stress symptoms for our kids. So SAMHSA has come out with 6 principles of trauma-informed care. And so if you are interested in being a trauma-informed teacher, having a trauma-informed classroom, having a trauma-informed school, these 6 things are what needs to happen in order for that to take place. So the first is safety. So if someone feels physically and social, emotionally safe, that is always a good step in the right direction to be trauma informed. The first thing is to definitely identify what safety means. And so we encourage every school to have a school climate survey, because that will be able to help you identify what your staff, your teachers, your students, your parents, what safety means to them, and if they feel safe. And so a lot of times we see that we are taking care of physical safety with having gated access to the schools, or key cards to get into different buildings, and resource officers at the front door. And so sometimes that physical safety is there, but we're not paying attention a lot to the social and emotional safety of our kids. And so this is where a good SEL curriculum will come into play to help kind of address those needs. So to be trustworthy and transparent, this is so, so, so important for you as the teacher and administration to be seen as someone who is trustworthy. And we see a lot of times where the school is the only stability that some of these kids have in their lives. They know that if they go to school today, I'm going to have air conditioning, I'm going to have food, I'm going to have an adult supervision throughout the day. And so to have that trustworthiness and that transparency is very important. Peer support. So we want to foster that student to student relationship. We want to be able to have our students to feel safe. When we're doing group therapy, we see a lot of that is that kids are looking to their peers for support and help. And if you have, if you're fostering that and you're strengthening that peer support, that is building trust and collaboration with not only the entire school, but within the students themselves. Collaboration. It must be known that everyone is going to have a role in being trauma informed. So this is from administration, this is teachers, this is janitors and cafeteria workers. Everybody is on the same page, and you're working together to heal what has happened or to become a trauma informed school. Empowerment. This is very important, especially now that we're seeing, to strengthen and recognize what is going on, and to build upon our knowledge, and to build upon our advocacy for our kids. And this is also when you talk a little bit about resilience and how you are working to heal and to recover. And then finally, and really important, again, the cultural humility, that we have to identify those cultural and gender stereotypes and biases and work together to alleviate that and to be responsive to those needs. And then not sweep things under the rug. Talk about the historical trauma, talk about what has happened in the past and what is happening now, and how we can move forward.
Hi, this is Dr. Bailey, and I'm going to start. Dr. Conrad talks a little bit about background and giving you a little information on trauma and what constitutes as a trauma. But now we're moving on to what can help you in the classroom as a trauma-informed teacher. And that all begins with your behavior management technique. And so as you see in this picture, there's 7 things that you can do to help your behavior management technique look like it's trauma-informed. And that we start out with number 1 as lay out clear expectations. And that starts day 1, even with open house. If you're doing parent, meet the children or meet the students and meet the parents, or even the first couple of days of school, you want to lay out clear expectations, but you also want to have them be involved with what is expected of the classroom. So use this time to talk with the students and know what your expectations are, but ask them what their expectations are. So it's kind of collaborative more than just I'm the teacher and here's my expectations, but get some information from your students and then come up with goals and expectations for the classroom and classroom rules together. So definitely have your outline of what your expectations are, but have room available for students to come in and kind of tell you what their expectations are too. This will help with the second one, forming relationships is very important. And in social work, we call it rapport building. And when we're meeting with clients for the first time and students for the first time, we are working on that relationship. And I know with education and what all the things you have to get done in a day, if you spend just a couple of minutes on this in the beginning and begin forming those relationships by asking them what their expectations are and about doing get to know you things. And a lot of people do open house or meet the students, and that helps form relationships. So forming those relationships are very important too. The third one is harness the power of compromise. And again, as we go down, each one builds on each other. So that compromise is, you have your idea of how your classroom is going to look, but when students come in and have their own ideas too, then that's where compromise begins with students and with other teachers and with administration. Like, always be open to other ideas and not be so rigid and be a little bit more flexible. The use of humor with behavior management. I know, and I'm not sure how many people use social media or look at the news, but a lot of teachers over the last couple of years have come up with handshakes, little dances, little things to make the classroom a little bit more fun and a little less rigid. And so just having something unique as that, like, it doesn't have to be a dance because everybody's not dancers, but a handshake or something that's unique to your classroom and your environment that would that students would like. I know TikTok is a huge thing now. I can't TikTok. I don't know how to use TikTok, but a lot of TikToks have been going on and challenges in the classrooms for use of humor. With some of the schools that we work with that are using trauma informed as their basis, that's what they've been doing. They've just been putting in a little bit more fun into the classrooms. The fifth one is allow for redos. I'm a fan of the 3 strikes and you're out rule. Like, you have, I give you 3 times to do something, and then after that, we're gonna have to try something different. But every day needs to come in. Like, you can't have 2 strike from yesterday and not start over the next day. So making sure that we're allowing for redos and not like cutting children off or students off after they do 1 thing or 2 things wrong. The other thing is that we found too with behavior management is praising, and not just the students that are doing things wrong, but praising students that are doing things right. Instead of focusing on the negative behaviors, try focusing on the positive behaviors. Like, if you have a classroom and you have several people that's following directions, and say the direction is sit, quiet time and sit and read, and you have 4 students that are throwing well, I hope they're not throwing pencils, but they're throwing paper, or they're talking or not doing what you asked them to do. But you have 10 students that are actually sitting in their desk reading. Focus on what they're doing to get all the other ones to kind of buy in, saying, oh, okay, she is looking, she is watching, and she's looking for more positive behaviors. She or he is looking for positive behaviors as opposed to the negative attention. Because a lot of kids who are exposed to trauma is used to that negative attention-seeking behavior, and that's how they get attention. And so they're going to carry that over to the classroom, and they're going to kind of cut up and act up to get that attention. And last but not least, validating feelings. Understanding where students are coming from, and understanding that that sometimes there's underlying issues that are causing them to act the way they are. So validating that they're mad or upset, and that you don't like something that just happened, but this is the rule. Especially, you can bring it back to your classroom rules if they're posted up somewhere. This is a rule, and this is how we said we were going to run the classroom. Oops. So we talked about what you can do with the behavior management technique. It builds on making sure we're implementing the best practices in the classroom. And that starts with knowing the signs of trauma. Now, Dr. Conrad gave you a little background on trauma. And of course, we're not asking you to assess students for traumatic experiences, but knowing if a student who started out the year with straight A's and come into class and participate in class, and you notice a change in their behavior or their demeanor, then you need to make a referral to your guidance counselor or your social worker or the administration, depending on where you are and what school and what your school protocols are. But knowing the signs, and I know a lot of schools are probably going to move towards a system-wide screening, but knowing what screeners are out there, and that starts with also your school environment too. And we'll talk a bit about that in a little bit, about how the school contributes to you being able to do a trauma-informed classroom. But just knowing the signs, and if you the video we shared today is a really good video. I love that video because it kind of helps break down how traumatic experiences work with the child's brain. But that's the first thing of implementing trauma-informed best practices in the classroom, is knowing the signs of trauma. The next thing is providing consistency and structure. And that goes back to why we started with behavior management and talking about behavior management in the classroom, because you have to be consistent. So if you're going to follow the classroom rules, we have to follow them all the time. So if one child's going to get in trouble for violating the classroom rules, the other child has to get in trouble for violating the classroom rules. And each time, all the time. Sometimes you get tired of correcting the same behavior over and over again. But research shows consistency is very important. And a lot of kids that are exposed to trauma aren't getting consistency on a regular basis. The structure goes back to the behavior management piece of it, because if you provide a structured environment, and it doesn't have to be rigid structured, like have room for the humor and the fun, but some type of structured environment where they know exactly what to expect and how to expect it. And this is how the day is going to run. Like, even if it's on a daily basis, you coming in and checking in with class and providing this is what our day is going to look like. For the older schools and middle school and high school, where you have multiple children come in and out of the day, you would do that every time you have a different class. So if you're in elementary and you have the same children all day, you kind of do that in the beginning and you probably don't have to do it again. But if you're in the middle school and high school, of course, you're going to have a lot of different students coming in and out. And so you're going to have to provide that structure for them again. If you don't already have any training on social emotional learning, it is time for you to get serious about it. There's tons of information about social emotional learning, and it's important that that you understand how children learn and how the emotions and everything plays into that part. So that's a whole nother training in itself. It's an extension of trauma-informed care. So I can't go into so many details just about what social emotional learning is, but there's tons of information about that. The other thing is you use restorative practices over zero tolerance. And it is really hard, especially since we have a lot of zero tolerance for bullying and things like that. There's some things that you have to cut the line off on. But in the classroom, like I said, with behavior management, kind of giving redos, like having them come every day with a fresh slate. Not remember you felt you got out of your seat 10 times yesterday, not keep reminding them of the day before, but just keep moving on, and making sure that with restorative practices, you are not just sending to TOR, you're not just expelling them or suspending them, but we want to try to do some things where they could earn being in the classroom or earn not being expelled, and what can, like a behavior plan on things like that. So use a little bit more behavior plans and not so much of as I'm sending you out to TO timeout, or I'm sending you to at home suspension and things like that. Like have some things in place that can build up to that. Okay, of course you can't have a menace to society in the classroom. Like at that point, they need more intensive care that you can give them in the classroom, but starting somewhere in the classroom. And again, last but not least, taking care of yourself. Social workers do it often. We have all kind of CEUs on burnout and self-care. And I use the example of when you're in an airplane, they ask for you to put your mask on. If we lose oxygen, they actually put your mask on before putting anybody else's mask on. That's because if you've lost oxygen trying to help somebody else, then you're probably not gonna be able to help them either. So I love that analogy, just because you wanna make sure that you're taking care of yourself. Secondary trauma is huge with helping professions. Teachers are in the helping profession, and you see a lot and you hear a lot, and it could take a toll on you. So making sure that you have good self-care practices, whether it is a group of people that you get together and you are able to process things, refer, you wouldn't want to talk about children specifically, but you still want to talk about things that has bothered you. In social work, we call it supervision. I'm not quite sure if y'all have something like a big buddy or a lead teacher or something like that in each of your school environments, but figure out who you can talk to talk about your feelings about your day. Try to go home and do something that you enjoy yourself, whether it's with your children or reading a book. But sometimes we don't practice too much of self-care, which leads to burnout, which leads to not being effective in the classroom because you haven't properly taken care of yourself. Just a few reminders. I know, especially in my recent homeschooling experiment, it's sometimes hard when you're not feeling like you're heard, but avoid yelling at all possible, just because sometimes for children who have been exposed to trauma, such as domestic violence or abuse, yelling is just a trigger. And so that's just going to trigger them and they're going to shut down and they're not going to hear anything you're saying anyway. So getting into a yelling match with a student is not always the best. Also, avoid traditional behavior management systems. And I was talking to Dr. Conrad about this the other day when we were preparing for these presentations. Is I know when I was in school, the traditional behavior management system was you lose your recess, okay? Your recess is taken away, and right now, and that's when we had like 2 30-minute recesses. Now recess is probably 10 or 15 minutes in the classrooms. So you want to avoid trying to take away the only active time they get, because when they're releasing that energy and releasing dopamine to their brain, they are going to be able to function better in a classroom. So avoiding those type of things and coming up with creative new token systems, maybe new ways to engage students and have them come up with ways to make them engaged and tell them how they what consequences they think are important for their actions is a good way to do so as well. Sometimes we may engage in a power struggle with students. However, again, with students who experience trauma, those power struggles often lead to not like fond memories of what's going on in their home environment or school environment. And so being direct and directing people back to your classroom rules and your classroom expectations and moving on. I've seen it firsthand in a classroom observation that I did with one of our schools that is implementing trauma-informed care. And I saw this done very eloquently, where the teacher and the student was challenging the teacher, and the teacher was using the trauma-informed practices that we've taught her and what we were focusing on and working on to just de-escalate the situation. And actually, by engaging with the student using these practices and calming the student time and giving the student time to walk out and get some water to come back in and start over, worked for her. So just using non-traditional, rigid behavior management techniques would go a long way with trauma-informed classrooms. We talked about the taking of the recess as a consequence, because in the end, it doesn't really help a student. And being discreet and avoid embarrassment, having a sign of, I feel like you need to calm down, won't you get a sip of water, won't you take a trip to the bathroom and put some water on your face. Just being discreet and avoid too much embarrassment for a student who may be in trouble or not engaging as you want them to.
So I'm going to briefly go over an intervention that I've used several times in my practice, as well as I use it myself whenever I fly on a plane. It's called the grounding technique. And what this does is it gets your emotions and your senses in check, and it levels out when your senses are on high alert. So as we know, and as Dr. Bailey had said, a lot of times kids who've experienced trauma yelling and loud noises are triggers for them. And so we see their sensitivity to senses. So the first thing that I tell them to do is to name 5 things that you see. And so as they're naming 5 things, after each thing that they say, they're to take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And so, for example, I would say, all right, let's talk about 5 things that you see. And so they would say, I see a desk, and then breathe in through their nose, out through their mouth. I see the chalkboard, in through your nose, out through your mouth. And so they're naming these 5 things. Once they've done that, then they'll name 4 things that they feel. And they're still continuing that breathing to kind of get those senses in check and to calm them down. So then they could say, I feel my pants in through their nose, out through their mouth with the breathing. I feel the desk, in through their nose, out through their mouth with breathing. And so they continue to do that for the 4 things that they feel. Then the 3 things that they hear. This could be the air conditioner. This could be the classroom next to them. This could be the music class down the hallway, whatever that is that they could hear. And they're, again, still breathing. 2 things that they smell, and then finally 1 thing that they taste. So I always keep peppermints, and all the nurses that I've ever worked with, they always had peppermints too, because I think it's like a magical, elixir that cures everything. But having that peppermint and that taste to help kind of stimulate the senses and calm them down, the ones that that's feeling that anxiety, that can be very helpful. So once we go through all of these things while they're taking their deep breaths into getting them to calm down, if it's still not working, then I ask them to go back up the list. So then they would name another thing that they taste and keep going up. And so this can be very beneficial for your classroom. And this can be done with the kids. Once they learn this technique, they don't have to have someone guiding them. They can do it on their own, and no one would have to know. So Dr. Bailey talked about being discreet and avoiding embarrassment. This is something that you could have a conversation with a kid and say, when you need to use your grounding technique, here are the things listed here on this poster that are in the classroom to remind you of when your senses are heightened.
So I know we talked about what you can do to be a trauma-informed teacher and how to create your trauma-informed classroom. Well, to be more effective and to be the best and put best practices forward, of course, you're going to have to be operating in a school that is willing to be trauma-informed. And this is just tips to create a trauma-informed school. Again, not sure if there's administrators in this conference. And not sure if what your power is in schools, but this is just tips on where you should get started, whether you need to bring this to your administrators, whether you are an administrator and want to bring this to your teachers. But the first step into creating a trauma-informed school is coming up with a system to identify and assess traumatic stress. So that's deciding whether you want to do a screener on all students, or if you want to do a screener on students that are referred to the counselor or the social worker if you have a school social worker. But that's where the talk begins on what we are as a school on the administration level. How are we going to identify and assess traumatic stress, whether a student has been exposed to trauma and that this trauma is affecting them. Next, once you decide that as a school and what's the process and what kind of crisis intervention that you want to do, you'll have to decide, okay, we've identified these students, but now what are we going to do and how are we going to address and treat the students? Now, there's not many social workers assigned to just one school in our state, unfortunately. So not every school has their own social worker, but I know at least a majority of our schools has a social worker that has been assigned to their school. And so you're going to want to get involved with your local school board. You want to tell them what you need to be able to address and treat traumatic stress once you identify and assess, have a process of identifying and assessing. You also want to make sure you leave room in any of your continuing educations and your workshops to teach trauma education and awareness. Like attending this workshop today definitely is the first step. because you're going to be a little bit more informed. You're going to be a little bit more ready to go, because this is the time that most teachers are. You've ended the school year. You're looking forward to the next school year. You're going to be going into practices in the beginning of the school year. We worked with a school this year where we came in August, and we kind of presented to them about trauma-informed care and how to do crisis intervention. And we did that at the beginning workshop that they at their meeting, so they can start to bring those questions they have and what they feel like they should do to plan the year. So they started at this time. So this is the best time to kind of start thinking about how we can create a trauma-informed school. You also want to make sure you have partnerships with students and families. The whole thing with community planning is making sure that we're not creating things that our community and our partners don't necessarily really need. And so maybe having a focus group or two with students and families that attend your school and ask them what they feel like they need, what kind of trauma they've been exposed to or they see in their community, because each community is going to be very different. You have to create trauma-informed learning environment and social emotional skills and wellness. And this goes back to educating teachers and administrators on what we need to do. And this is the first step. Like I said, this little 1 hour like tip of the iceberg introduction to creating a trauma-informed school. There's so much more information out there and so much more training and so much more resources to help with making sure that we are getting our students the help that they need so they can be academically successful. And to be academically successful, you have to have social and emotional skills. And you have to be socially, emotionally well. And a lot of our students are not, especially with the current pandemic going on. A lot of our administrators and our teachers may be affected by the pandemic as well. And so that comes with the self-care. And when I say identify and assess traumatic stress, I'm not just talking about your students. I'm also talking about some type of layer in there that identifies and helps teachers that may be on a tip of secondary trauma or maybe experiencing their own personal trauma and may need some extra assistance and help as well. Also, bring culture into it and culturally responsive. It's very important to understand how culture plays a part in any type of trauma and what each culture deems as traumatic. Because just because I think of something as traumatic, Dr. Conrad may think of something that's not. But meeting each student and each teacher and each administrator where they are is very important, because you have to you will never be able to live in their shoes, but you need to be empathetic to their culture and how the culture responds to something. Also, again, as I said before, the first couple of steps is brainstorming and thinking about ideas of how you're going to assess. But after you get those ideas and after you talk to the people you need to talk to about what you're going to do after you assess and where you're going to refer to, you need to integrate this into your emergency management and crisis response. Every principal, vice principal, counselor, and teacher should know what your emergency management response is. I know Dr. Conrad talked about safety earlier, and we often deem safety as physical, like putting up gates, putting up video cameras, putting up locks, making sure that the environment, the campus is safe. But emergency response and management, and you have fire drills, and you have, unfortunately, we also have other drills where if there's an intruder on campus. So this is another thing you need to do with emergency management is the mental health capacity and the safety of someone's mental health. And so that's what you should think of it in terms as you have rules and guidelines for fire drills and active shooter drills, but do you really have something in place for if a child is in active crisis or a student is in active crisis? And you may have, because a lot of people have been moving towards this. So it might not work for your school as well, because a lot of us have crisis management policies that we've never had to implement, or if we implement it, it wasn't really implemented to the best of its ability. So revamp and revise those depending on what your community needs are. Next is understanding and addressing staff self-care and secondary traumatic stress. I talked a little bit about this earlier, but it is very vital that we identify us as having secondary trauma and how it affects us. This usually happens right after, I want to say October to like November, when you have that long stretch and there's no breaks, teachers start to get burnt out because the excitement of the new school year has kind of gone down, especially in the spring too. There's a part where you have a break here, break there, and then there's a long stretch where you don't have a break. Those are the times you want to be trying to address self-care, because they've gone so long with caring for others, and getting in the excitement of a new school year or the excitement of being back from winter break is kind of dying down. So they need to kind of make sure they're check themselves and make sure they're doing it well as well. Evaluating and revising school discipline policies and practices. A lot of people are implementing positive behavior support in their school, but sometimes those things aren't working as well as they can work. And so just taking the time to revise and say, did this work? What worked well? What needs improvement? And keep revising them. And so, you have a system where you have decreased the number of suspensions or expulsions each year. So setting goals for yourself. Collaborating across systems and establishing community partnerships. And I talked about that earlier, knowing that working as a trauma-informed team, that means having an administrator, a counselor, and a teacher on a team that's discussing and collaborating across the systems in the school, as well as bringing a school board in as well, having someone on the school board that comes in and so they can tell you what resources you do and do not have. Knowing what mental health resources are available in your community as well, establishing partnerships with those communities as well is very important. The community center, what can they offer? What services do they have? Because it's going to come back to, you've identified someone who have issues because they have been exposed to trauma, but then you don't have any referrals or resources for them. So making sure you're establishing what is in your community and what's available to your students in your community is very important as well.
So when we're moving forward, this is a multi-phase process for adopting a trauma-sensitive approach. This is very important if you have listened to what we discussed today, and this is something that you're interested in. The first is to prepare to adopt a trauma-sensitive approach. Right now, we know a lot of districts, a lot of schools are working hard at trying to figure out what the fall is going to look like, whether that be virtual, on campus, or both. And so now is the time to talk about how we can prepare to have a trauma-sensitive school and to be a trauma-sensitive teacher and have a trauma-sensitive classroom. We're going to give you at the end of this presentation just a slide that has a couple of things that we would like for you to do, like kind of like homework. And one of those is going to be envision what your trauma-sensitive school looks like. What do you need? If you have completed a school climate survey, that is great. Look at those results and see what is needed at your school. Think about safety, not only in the terms of physical, but also in social, emotional. Look at those things to align your trauma sensitivity with other approaches. So if you are doing PBIS, have that be a trauma sensitive approach. Your MTSS, your tiers, those kids, have that aligned with trauma sensitivity. All of the things that you are already implementing in place, the behavior modifications like we talked about earlier in your classrooms, rearranging that to look as a trauma sensitive behavior mod instead of the traditional behavior mods. And then finally, to sustain trauma sensitivity. It doesn't just start and end with one presentation or one professional development. It is something that has to be ongoing. It's something that needs to be talked about often, evaluated and reevaluated to see if it's working. So making sure that you're sustaining that trauma sensitivity and that you have buy-in from everyone in the school. Because if you don't have buy-in, it is not going to work. Like I said, we have a few things that we would like for you to kind of think about and to do on your own. Take a look at those SAMHSA principles of trauma-informed care. What are you doing in your classroom or in your school that are already in place? You may not have known that that's what you're doing, but to take a look at those principles and try to align what is already being done. Think about what you can do or what the other teachers in your school or what administration in your school can do to move forward into a trauma-informed and trauma-sensitive direction. So we would love for you to kind of think about that. And if you have any responses that you would love for us to kind of know about, please send us an email. We would love to see what you're already doing or what ideas that you have. Here's a list of resources that we found to be very beneficial for teachers. These websites have been really, really good at trying to break things down to where we understand them. It talks about research, it gives some ideas. So these are some great resources for you to have. This is also just a little handout just on managing educator stress and well-being. Like Dr. Bailey said, we know that secondary trauma is really high in social workers and counselors and teachers, and especially now. And so this is just a little handout for y'all to read at your leisure. But we appreciate you attending this conference and this presentation. Here you'll see our contact information. Again, if you need anything, please let us know. We want to thank you for everything that you do. We both have kids at home, and we found out, this is definitely why we teach adults and that we are not into teaching children. So we appreciate everything that you do for the kids in Louisiana and trying to educate them and being that support system for them. And so if you have any questions, we have about 10 minutes, I think, left. So we welcome any questions that you may have.